दोस्तों आप सुन रहे हैं रेडियो मनपसंद FM 91.1 पर, और साथ ही साथ ये कार्यक्रम स्ट्रीम होता है हमारे रेडियो मनपसंद ऐप पर, जो कि आपको अवेलेबल है एंड्रॉयड और आईफोन के लिए, दोनों के लिए आपको iOS पर। और ये कार्यक्रम आप सुन रहे हैं, समय करीब 11 बज रहे हैं, और ये कार्यक्रम फिर से प्रसारित किया जाएगा शाम को 3 से 5 के बीच में। जैसा कि अभी रथ यात्रा की बात की, और रथ यात्रा जहाँ तक हम माइग्रेंट्स का प्रश्न है, हम लोग एक पैरेलल वर्ल्ड में रहते हैं जहाँ तक उसका सवाल है। ख़ास करके हम फर्स्ट जनरेशन के जो माइग्रेंट्स हैं वो अपनी एक अलग दुनिया बना के रखते हैं, अलग थलग रहते हैं, उनकी समस्याएं उन्हीं की होती हैं। इस दूसरे देश में हम अपने चुपचाप काम में लगे रहते हैं और इन समस्याओं और इश्यूज़ के बारे में कुछ ज़्यादा बोलते नहीं हैं। कहते हैं ना कि डोंट वांट टू रॉक द बोट। लेकिन दूसरी जनरेशन के माइग्रेंट्स जो यहाँ पले बढ़े हैं, इन समस्याओं को चुपचाप सहना नहीं चाहते हैं, अपनी आवाज़ उठाते हैं। और इसकी में सबसे बहुत अच्छी पहल की है जोया पटेल ने, जो एक फिजियन इंडियन ऑस्ट्रेलियन है। उन्होंने अपनी एक पुस्तक लिखी थी, नो कंट्री वुमन। इस किताब में उन्होंने बड़ी बेबाकी से अपने एक्सपीरियंसेस, अपने व्यूज़, अपने ओपिनियंस शेयर किए एक माइग्रेंट के बतौर। इन एक्सपीरियंसेस के द्वारा उन्होंने ऑस्ट्रेलियन सोसाइटी में कुछ सीरियस इश्यूज़ पर सवाल उठाए, और रेसिज्म पर, आइडेंटिटी क्राइसिस पर, एक फेमिनिस्ट के बतौर। और ये सवाल न केवल ऑस्ट्रेलियन सोसाइटी के लिए थे, वरन हम माइग्रेंट्स के लिए भी थे, चाहे वो फर्स्ट जनरेशन के हों और सेकंड जनरेशन के हों। इस किताब को काफ़ी सराहा गया था, और पहली बार मेन इस स्ट्रीम ऑस्ट्रेलिया को महसूस हुआ कि यंग माइग्रेंट्स और माइग्रेंट्स जनरली किस तरह से यहाँ पर ऑस्ट्रेलिया में अनुभव करते हैं। जोया पटेल एक बहुत ही टैलेंटेड राइटर हैं, और फेमिन आर्टसी, जो कि एक फेमिनिस्ट पत्रिका है, उसकी एडिटर हैं। साथ ही साथ उनके आर्टिकल्स कैनबरा टाइम्स और अन्य ऑनलाइन पब्लिकेशंस में पब्लिश हो चुके हैं। हमने उनसे बातचीत करी इन विभिन्न विषयों पर। आइए सुनते हैं इस बातचीत का पहला अंश। पब्लिश हो चुकी हैं। जोया पटेल, यू आर वेलकम टू रेडियो मनपसंद।
Thank you so much for having me.
Zoya, you migrated with your family when you were at the age of 3, and tell us briefly about your early life in Australia and then your journey to become a successful writer and editor.
Yeah, sure. So I migrated here, like you said, when I was 3 in 1992, and that was from Fiji. So my grandparents were from India, from Gujarat, and they moved to Fiji in the 40s, so still when it was under colonial rule, and both of my parents were born in Fiji, and that's where they met, and they got married. And then we first migrated to live in Albury, which is a rural kind of regional town in southern New South Wales. And it was a bit of a culture shock, because not only had we left Fiji and come here, but we were in a small community. There weren't a lot of Indians. There wasn't a big multicultural community at first. But we did actually find a really great group of fellow migrants. And I think the 6 years that we spent in Albury are some of our favourite years of being in Australia as a family. We had a lot of close family friends that we made, and it was a really nice way to kind of be introduced to the country in some ways. But the flip side was that we did experience a fair bit of racism. Certainly I did, growing up and at school. And then we came to Canberra when I was about 10, and things changed then. Canberra is a bigger place. There are a lot of migrants, as you guys would know. It's a much more cultural community. But in terms of writing, I've been writing my whole life. Before I could really actually write, I used to just get books and scribble in them. And my parents used to buy me exercise books, and I just filled them with stories. And that was kind of the main toy that I had. I really enjoyed doing that. And I started writing kind of professionally when I was a teenager. I got published in a local magazine for the first time when I was 15, and kind of kept going from there. So I wrote a lot of articles and short stories and things like that. And then eventually I wrote this book that's come out, and I've also written long form fiction. So hopefully my next book will be a novel. And I think writing the memoir was kind of a natural progression for me from other kinds of writing, because I've always been really interested in feminism and gender equality, and I think racial equality is like the natural next thing to look at, especially when you do grow up as a migrant. So I was always writing about these things, and then gradually it kind of turned into a book. And I was really lucky to get signed to an agent and have it come out and be published.
So what was the reaction of your parents and Fijian Indian community and Australian community of your book? I mean, it is a very good book, and there is no doubt about that. This is the first time, a migrant is expressing her opinions and on the issues which we normally do not talk.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do think these kinds of issues have been written about before, but I think the Indian experience and the Fijian Indian experience probably hasn't been as explored, so it was pretty great to be able to do that. My parents have always supported my writing, but I think a lot of Indian parents listening would probably agree that it's a little bit scary when someone starts writing about your family in public, and it's not something that we don't really do that as a culture very much, I think. Like, we don't really share that kind of intimate knowledge of our family lives that much, and I did speak to my parents about it and got their blessing before I kind of proceeded, but I was a bit cheeky. I didn't give them the book to read until it actually came out because I really wanted to write it from my perspective, and I try really hard in the book to make it clear that I'm not writing on behalf of my parents. I want them to tell their own stories, and that's not for me to do, or my siblings. I have 2 sisters and a brother. But they reacted really well when they finally read it, and really differently. So my mum, first of all, they fought over who got to read it first. And I think my dad actually snuck it away from mum and read it overnight one night. And he had the best reaction. Mum was just really pleased, really proud. I think it made them think about a lot of things that we don't really talk about in different ways. But my dad said the next day, he was like, "Yeah, I read your book. It's very good, very good." And then he said, "White people are going to be very confronted by this." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Didn't think it was going to be confronting, but I get what he means. And I think that has been the case. People my age and of my generation, I think, understand some of the concepts that I'm writing about, even if they're not migrants. They can kind of understand it a bit more because we talk about this stuff more. But certainly the older generation has been a little bit more surprised by some of what I write about. I think a lot of people don't want to accept that racism is as prevalent in Australia and that it happens as much as it does. But the thing that's been most exciting for me in terms of how people have received it is a lot of Indian young women and young men kind of reaching out to me and saying, "Wow, I really resonated a lot with what you said, and it's the first time that I've seen my experiences written down," and I think that's been really important to me, and that's definitely the highlight.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, these experiences we all share, but no one has gone and put it in writing and published it as a book. So, of course, I think the mainstream society has, I think, was, as he's saying, that maybe took with a bit of surprise, but at least I think it has been a favorable reception, I would say.
Yeah, definitely critically. I've been really pleased with how much support there's been. And I also think, it says something about the change that's happening in society. I do think people are more open to hearing these stories, but also more aware that Australian identity is really complicated. And, if we think about the fact that we have Indigenous Australians who still suffer a lot of oppression and prejudice, and then we have, white Australians who may have been here for generations, but then we also have a really big migrant culture from all countries that come to this country and call it home. And I think people are realizing that we need to be more open and accepting of those stories and to listen to them more. And it's pretty exciting to be kind of part of that movement.
So your book is titled No Country Woman, and I think जैसे कि आप अपनी book में कह रही हैं कि you are Fijian, Indian, Australian, yet you feel that you do not belong to any country. Does this sense of not belonging apply to all migrants or just to only second generation migrants? जहाँ तक हमारी generation का सवाल है, we know where do we belong, even though we are in this country, we still think that we belong to India or Fiji.
Yeah, definitely, and that's been probably the interesting thing about growing up here is I look at my parents and they have a really strong sense of identity, of cultural identity, because they always say we're Indian first, Fijian second, and then they're Muslim. And those are the things that are really fundamental to who they are. But they grew up surrounded by their culture. And, all of their family, all of their friends were also Fijian Indian. They go back to India, they're surrounded by people who they love and they know. They go to Fiji, they have all of that family connection. But for me, especially as the youngest, I grew up entirely here. I don't remember Fiji. I don't remember living there, but I do remember going there every year as a child. But the difference was when we went back to Fiji, my parents were like, well, we're going home. To me, I was leaving home, and I was going to a different place where I didn't understand the culture as well. And I enjoyed it, but it was always a holiday. It didn't feel like home to me, and it never has. And I think that's the real issue. It's not so much about which generation, but I think you're right in saying it's about how old you are and where you grow up, where you're educated, where you're raised. And I think it's hard because in Fiji, Indians aren't really considered Fijian because, my family primarily, my mother's side of the family came over to Fiji as indentured labourers. So they were over by the British, and my dad's side moved there of their own choice when in the 40s, but they were Indians, right? Like they're not Fijians. And for a long time, Fiji had things in the constitution that, didn't allow Indians to vote and things like that. So that's a difficult kind of identity to be in. And then when you go to India, because we're Fijian Indian, often we're treated like we're not Indian. They say, oh, well, you're from Fiji.
Yeah.
Hindi isn't the right Hindi because our Hindi is very, it's a mix of different languages. And then you come to Australia and you can't be Australian because you're not white or you're Fijian Indian. So I think that's where the title comes from, and just this constant explaining that I've had to do in my life of where I'm from. Because if I say, I remember once going to a conference overseas, and there was a girl there from India, and she said to me, are you Indian? And I said, oh yeah. And she said, whereabouts from India are you from? And I said, oh, well, my family's mostly from Gujarat, but we're Fijian Indian. And she turned around and said, oh, well, then you're not really Indian then. I remember having this moment where I thought, oh my, like, who else do I have to explain this to? It's very hard to feel any real sense of identity when you're constantly being told that that's not true, or that can't be right, or there must be some other explanation. So I think it's harder also when I would say these things to my parents and they would say, it's just not that complicated. You're Fijian Indian. What's the big deal? Like, just accept, move on. But for them, they fit in so well in those cultures. And, I always felt like, well, my Hindi isn't very good, or I have an accent, and it doesn't feel normal for me to wear, shalwar kameez and walk around in clothing that I don't normally wear. And all of those things, particularly when you're a teenager and you're trying to figure out who you are, I think they do make it really complicated. And I think now I have a better sense of a cultural identity, but I'm 30 now. It took me a long time to really figure that out, and I still don't think I have figured it out. It'll be a while, I think, before that starts to feel right. And I do look at, my nieces and my nephew, and they have it even harder because they have had no close connection. They weren't born anywhere else. They're only Australian. And even though I can speak Hindi fluently, I don't always feel confident in it. They can't speak Hindi at all. And they can only understand some of it, even though we speak in it all the time around them. It's a completely different thing. And I think generation by generation, it becomes harder for them to feel connected to being Indian and Fijian, but it becomes easier for them to feel Australian. So I think that's the balance.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that, especially being, I guess, younger. I wanted to ask, do you consider, though, that, like, this experience of identity confusion is the same for, say, second-generation migrants growing up now, like your nieces and your nephews? Like, do you think, though, maybe there's been a change, so political correctness and more, like, wokeness about racism in the current times? Do you think that's made people more aware about casual racism and a bit more aware of their own microaggressions?
I really, really hope so. And I do think that in some ways. So even if I look at things like the way that schools talk about multiculturalism now compared to when I was in school, like I know that my nieces have been taught about, the Indigenous cultures that lived on this land in far more detail than we were ever taught. And I also know that they don't get questioned as much about being Australian as I always felt like I was. And that is generational. And I do think that people of our generation and people of the generation directly above ours have changed that a lot, because we've talked more about multiculturalism. People do understand that, you know, cultural identity isn't about skin color, it isn't about background, it's actually about who you are and how you live. And I do think that's getting better, but I am still surprised sometimes by things that they say that tell me that they still experience some racism. I remember my eldest niece, when she was quite young, had just started going to school, and she came home one day and was asking all these questions like, why do we have this skin color, and why is dad so much darker than mum, and I hope that I can be lighter skinned, and I'd like to be fair, and all of these things that we were like, where are you getting this from? You know, we don't talk like that at home, but it does seep in, and ultimately we don't have a lot of representation of people of color in television and in our media, and it's getting better, but you still grow up seeing majority white people on our screens, in our political houses, in leadership, and I do think that has an impact. So I hope it changes, and I think it is changing, but I think it's still a slow process.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that, I guess we can all just hope that some changes come this way, but I have seen, I think also with the rise of social media, it's like now accessible to everyone, so people like me and people who look like me can just upload and post and share, and then, you know, it's not really like this whole system of the media deciding who's like going to be on the screen. It's like now up to the younger generations. But
you know, the exciting thing to see is, I mean, I don't know if you've seen this, but there was a Netflix show that was released in the past couple of months called Never Have I Ever.
Yeah, I really love that show. It was kind of fun to watch.
About, you know, an Indian American girl and her really normal experience of being a teenager. And a friend of mine messaged me to be like, how great is this show? And not even because it was about an Indian. She just thought it was a great show. And to me, I was like, I can't explain how much that made me feel grateful, because always I felt as though no one would be interested in my stories because I was Indian. And I write in my book about how I felt like I was always kind of a sideline character. I was never the starring character because I wasn't white. And I was made to feel that way through lots of different, pathways. And I don't think my friends meant to make me feel that way, but it happened. And now I see shows like that come out, and I think, isn't that amazing? Like, I love the fact that my nieces are going to watch stuff like that growing up, and it's completely normalized. Her being Indian is not the focal point of that show at all. You know, it's about a girl who loses her father and everything that happens around that. And I just love the fact that her diversity is just part and parcel of it. It's just normal. And that's all I want. I want it to be normalized.
But I think it's still in the areas like politics or business, if we look around. The ethnic communities are hardly represented over there. I think it will take a long time before that changes. Diversity is basically there. They take we can have more women as a representative, but not ethnic people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I also think we see these kinds of patterns where some ethnicities are considered more good migrants versus bad migrants. And
that's right.
Right now I feel like Indians are having a kind of good moment, like people are like, oh, well, you're a good model minority, you come in, you get jobs, you work hard, these are all good things. But the backlash of that is that it's being used to contrast against groups that the mainstream has decided aren't as good. And in Canberra, I really noticed that with the way that people talk about South Sudanese people, for example. My sister works as a leader in a multicultural community organization. And, I look at some of the diversity that we see coming through Canberra, and that diversity isn't represented in our kind of leadership, and certainly not in our media. It's all changing. And I think part of what I'd like to see is just this sense of kind of pitting minority groups against each other really go away. And I lived in Scotland for a year. I found it really interesting over there because when people in Australia ask me where I'm from, if I say, oh, I'm Australian, which sometimes I do just because I like to mess with people and kind of, complicate that question, and they'll say, oh, no, I mean, where are you really from? When I was in Scotland, if people asked me where I was from and I said, oh, I'm Australian, they're like, oh, that's great. Yeah, I thought your accent was different. Like, no one ever questioned that I could be Indian and be Australian when I was in Scotland. And that's because they have a really big migrant community of Indians, and it's just accepted. like that's just part of the culture of the UK. And it wasn't always like that. When my uncles first moved to the UK, in the early kind of 60s, they were treated terribly. But over the years, that's changed. And I hope that change keeps happening. But I think you're right. It's a slow process. And we have so much more that we still need to achieve. So even when things are good, I think it's important to know what could be better.
हम बातचीत कर रहे हैं जोया पटेल के साथ और बात कर रहे हैं माइग्रेंट्स के अनुभवों के बारे में। एक बात मैं कहना चाहूँगा कि मेरे साथ इंटरव्यू जो कर रही हैं वो तन्वी नंगरानी भी कर रही हैं। अब तन्वी का परिचय की ज़रूरत नहीं, वो मेरी बेटी है और वो भी इन मामलों में काफ़ी रुचि लेती है और इस इंटरव्यू में वो भी मेरा साथ दे रही है। आइए सुनते हैं जोया पटेल की पसंद का एक गीत और फिर उनके बातचीत का दूसरा अंश सुनते हैं।
चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 चल छैया 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 सारे इश्क की छाँव चल छैया छैया सारे इश्क की छाँव चल छैया पाँव जन्नत चले चल छैया छैया पाँव जन्नत चले चल छैया चल छैया 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 वो यार है जो खुशबू की तरह जिसकी जुबान उर्दू की तरह मेरी शाम रात मेरी कायनात वो यार मेरा सैया सैया चल छैया 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 महके तो नजर आ जाए कहीं गुलपोश कभी इतराए कहीं महके तो नजर आ जाए कहीं तावीज़ बना के पहनूं उसे आयत की तरह मिल जाए कहीं तावीज़ बना के पहनूं उसे आयत की तरह मिल जाए कहीं गुलपोश कभी इतराए कहीं महके तो नजर आ जाए कहीं तावीज़ बना के पहनूं उसे वो यार है जो ईमान की तरह मेरा नगमा वही मेरा कलमा वही मेरा नगमा नगमा मेरा कलमा।
आप सुन रहे हैं रेडियो मनपसंद और बातचीत कर रहे हैं हम जोया के साथ। जोया जो कि एक राइटर और एडिटर हैं यहाँ कैनबरा में और उनके साथ तन्वी और मैं बातचीत कर रहे हैं कई यहाँ पर माइग्रेंट्स के अनुभवों के विषय के बारे में। आइए इस वार्ता का दूसरा अंश सुनते हैं और देखते हैं कि जोया इसमें क्या कहती हैं।
वो ये है कि when we migrate there is a huge cost of migration, loss of language, there's a loss of culture and a sense of alienation also. अब एक और तो इकोनॉमिक बेनिफिट्स, इकोनॉमिक वेलबींग होते हैं. इज दिस कॉस्ट वर्थ पेइंग फॉर दिस लॉस?
Such a big question, isn't it? And I think I sometimes have this conversation with my parents because it was a cost that they've paid more than what I've paid, because they gave up their friends, their family, you know, the community that they were part of to come here to give us a better life. And when I look at it from the perspective of, you know, them moving from Fiji, when we moved to Australia, there was a lot of political unrest in Fiji, and it was just before the George Spade coup happened in 2000, and it just wasn't a place where they felt that they could give us a safe life, but also one with all the opportunity that they wanted us to have. And I'm so grateful that they moved here for my sake, because I don't think I would have, you know, I don't think I'd be a writer in the same ways. I certainly don't think that we would have had the economic opportunities that we've had, like you said. But what they lost is really significant. On one hand, yes, I've lost that kind of close connection to my culture, but they also put a lot of effort and energy into giving us that. And I think the loss for me, I can see it in the generation before me and the generation after me. So, you know, I still feel like my parents, now that they're a bit older and, you know, they've done really well for themselves here and they've been able to retire early, but now they have all this free time and they're so far away from their communities. And I think that's really hard for them. You know, there isn't a big Fijian Indian community in Canberra, and they're really far from their family. And family is so important in our culture. And my dad, I think, really misses being able to be near his brothers and sisters. And technology helps, but it's not everything. So I think they lost a lot. And part of what they lost also is that we don't remember the things that they remember, and their children aren't close to their culture. And that must be really hard. I know that it's hard because we argue about it all the time, so it must be hard. But I wonder if they think that it's as worth it. And I think when I look at my nieces and nephews and I think about my future children, that's where I really feel like there's a loss, because if we're far removed from our culture, they're twice as far removed. And they don't have the interest either, really, in a lot of the things that we grew up with. Like, when I was growing up, we still spoke Hindi all the time at home. We still watched Bollywood movies, you know, all the time. We still, we went to festivals and we wore the clothes and we did mehndi, and, you know, we had all these things that were fundamental to our culture. But it's actually harder and harder to make that part of the lives of the younger generation, because people are busy and they're not as interested and it doesn't feel relevant to them. So, you know, often we'll sit there with my youngest nieces and we'll play this game where we say words in Hindi and they have to try and guess what it means in English, because and we try and pick words that they hear all the time, right? Like funny, or, you know, I can't even think of anything else, but we say all these things. Sometimes we say funny words like fugly to, you know, try and get them to think about what we say, and they get really anxious and they don't find it as fun anymore. And I think it's because they know that they don't understand it. And I worry that we make it too hard for them to kind of connect with the culture. So that is a big loss. And I think it's still worth it, but I think the real question is, why should we have to leave our cultures to have a better life? And, you know, that's a legacy of colonialism and global inequality. And I think it's really sad to me that, you know, we have to choose as people from countries that have had a colonial history. We have to choose whether we stay with our culture or we go somewhere where we can have a better life, because the better life can only really happen in like a Western country. And yeah, I think, you know, it's a really big question, but it's a balance. And I don't know if my parents would choose the same way if they could go back in time.
Yeah, I think you made that reference when you had a chat with your mom, where would she like to be? And she said Fiji. I think that sense of belonging, and I think the choice, it's hard. Like, you know, we want to live in our culture, maybe in India, but we should have a same education or development or facilities or infrastructure which we have access to in Australia. That would be ideal, but that does not happen. So we have to pay a cost of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned that you had conflicts, or I guess disagreements, say, with your family growing up because of clashes in cultures and values, and that's the experience of most migrant children. So what advice would you give to your younger self with the benefit of the experience and hindsight that you now have?
Yeah. Yes, we definitely had some epic conflicts and clashes over the years. And I think the thing that I can see now, and the only reason why we have such a good relationship now in my family, is I now understand that my parents weren't trying to stop me from having an Australian life. It was a combination of wanting to protect me and keep me safe, and also just fundamentally not understanding the things that I was interested in. So I always think about music, because I was a big music fan. I spent years doing music journalism. I interviewed, hundreds of bands, and all I ever wanted to do was go to concerts and gigs. And for my parents, coming from the backgrounds that they come from, a young woman going by herself to watch musicians play rock music at a bar is like possibly the most horrifying thing that they could think of, right? Like, it just didn't seem safe to them. But because I've grown up in this culture, it didn't occur to me to think that that would be a dangerous environment to be in. And so things like that I look back on, and at the time I'd be like, oh, they just don't understand me. They want to keep me from my passions. Why are they like this? It's so sexist. And now I'm like, actually, if it was my niece coming to me and she was 16 and she wanted to go to A&U bar to watch a rock band, would I let her go? Like, I would probably be like, can I come with you? And, we compromise. In the end, I could go to those gigs, but only if my brother went. And that was totally fine. Like, I liked my brother. He hung out over there. I hung out over there. And we had a nice time. But I look back now and I get that it comes from not only not understanding, but really wanting to protect their children, because they're in a completely different culture, and they didn't grow up in Australia. They don't know what it's like living here as a teenager, because they didn't do it. So I understand that now. And if I could go back in time, I'd say to that teenage version of me, just have more empathy. Like, be aware that if you explain why you want to do something, they're much more likely to understand you and to come on board. And I found that since the book came out, and everyone in my family read it, we actually started talking about things that we've never talked about before. And a lot of what we talked about was where the misunderstandings happened. Like when I thought my parents were doing one thing and they thought I was doing another thing, and we just weren't talking about what was important to me and why it was important. And the things that have that weren't conflicts were when I sat down and said to my parents, I really want to travel, and I want to travel by myself because I think it's an important experience to have. And I know that you're going to find that difficult. So the compromise is you can book the hotels that you want me to stay in, and I will make sure that I go with this friend. And, and like we'd come up with ways to compromise. And I think the compromise is the key thing. I can't blame them for wanting to protect me, even if it felt, stifling at the time. But I think communication and empathy have been the things that have really turned our relationships around. And I wish that I'd been a bit more like that when I was younger.
Yeah. That's really good advice. Hopefully I can relay that on to some of my friends who really need it. Yeah.
In your book, I think you have made quite a few references about the casual racism, which we migrants are target of quite often.
Yeah.
Do you think? I mean, we're just talking about your parent and ourselves, sort of this thing, and your generation. So this casual racism, you think that first generation like us is more tolerant, while the second generation like yours is not tolerant to that? Or in first generation, because we have grown up in India and Fiji, you made a reference of discrimination in Fiji. In India also we see discrimination in various forms. So is that the reason, or we just don't want to rock the boat?
I've always felt that it's actually the latter, that you don't want to rock the boat, but that's because the stakes are a lot higher. And I think when you grow up in Australia and you have the exact same education as everyone else, you have a sense of, I don't think it's entitlement, I think it's like a justified sense of what is right and what is wrong and what you should be owed. So when I was growing up and people were racist to me, not when I was a child, I took it really hard when I was a child, but as an adult, I'm very much like firm in my belief that that's absolutely not okay, and I will stand up for myself because I'm not afraid of any consequences. To me, it's like, well, if you want to be racist to me, I will 100% call you out. And then if you want to take that further, I don't mind. Like, do you want to escalate it? We can take it to workplace bullying and harassment. We can take it to the police. Like, you have no right to treat me badly, and so therefore I will not take it. Whereas after the book came out and we talked about kind of our shared experiences of racism, my dad was telling me about how when we first moved to Australia, he had a 1-year probation at his job. And so he'd moved his entire family, 4 children, to this new country. And he was the main income earner because my mum had me at home for the first little while and she worked at a supermarket and they tried to make it work. But if his job didn't work out, what was he going to do? He had 4 of us, 4 children, and the burden of that responsibility is huge. And there was kind of persistent racism at this workplace, and he was bullied quite significantly. He did not say a single thing until that year of probation was up, because for him it was like, there's a bigger picture here and I cannot risk losing my income and not being able to take care of my family. Now, I wouldn't do that, right? If someone was racist to me tomorrow, I'd take it straight to HR and say, this is completely, and I've done that. I've had situations where I have had to go to HR and say, this is unacceptable, and what are you going to do about it? Whereas my dad had to put his pride to one side and deal with that. And to me, there's so much admiration I have for that. He was so courageous to put aside his feelings and the injustice of it because he had a bigger purpose that he was working towards. But it also makes me really sad for him because he knew that at that time, no one was going to take his side. He was the first non-white person to be hired into his company ever. And they had to have a meeting of the board to agree to hire someone from Fiji. They said, surely we can find an engineer in Australia. But they couldn't, and he was amazing and he rose quite high in that company. But the stakes were so much higher. So I don't think it's that the older generation don't notice the casual racism. I think it's that they've learned to have to compromise on that because it hasn't always been as part of our society as it is now to call that stuff out. It hasn't always been something that people are willing to say is wrong and actually take action against. So I think it's only because of your generation that we, in my generation, are now able to be more comfortable and more able to say no to racism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like really interesting, and I think it makes me kind of realize that that's a kind of, not privilege, but I guess something that I am lucky that I can kind of be able to voice my own concerns about racism because I mean, really, there is no bigger picture for me. I just, I'm growing up with the rest of you, I should be treated the same. But I can understand where your dad was coming from, obviously, with having stakes and, having a family to support and everything. My next question is the racism debate has really come to the forefront now, especially with many eyes turned to Black Lives Matter and people gaining awareness about the poor treatment of Indigenous people in Australia. And there is no obvious, competition between who faces more racism, but sometimes it can feel trivial complaining about casual racism, especially when you hear news about extreme police brutality that is faced by some people based on their race. So I guess my question is there a place for a conversation about casual racism when some people may consider there to be more pressing issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question and very, very relevant, of course. I always think that when we talk about it in terms of like ranking racisms and what's worse and what's easier, what we're actually doing is saying that we can only have one conversation at a time. And so, the mainstream will only allow us to kind of push one issue, so we all have to prioritize and decide which one. When actually, the reason why we feel that way is because there's always been such a minority of, non-white voices in these spaces, in these debates. And so we're always feeling like we all have to vie for one spot. It reminds me of, when we talk about representation on boards and in leadership. I remember once having a conversation and a friend of mine was going for a board position and she said, oh well, but there's only one woman on the board, so I guess there can only be one spot basically, so now we're all fighting for that one spot. And I was like, well no, there's 12 spots on the board, all 12 of those could be filled with women, but we're told that it's just one, right? Or when my book came out and people said to me, oh, I feel like you've written my story, and I said, no, I've written my story. You can write your story as a brown person too. Why is it that we have any number of white men can write about World War II and no one thinks that there's too many books about World War II out there, but only one person can write about experiencing racism in Australia because there's not appetite for more than that? And so when we talk about, yes, there are really important and really systemic issues facing Indigenous Australians, and I think it's so important that we give priority to that issue and that we use our voices to raise it. But casual racism is actually part and parcel of those systemic problems. You know, systemic issues like Indigenous deaths in custody come from the attitudes that allow casual racism to exist. It's all part of the same thing. And so you have to call out all parts of it if we're ever going to make real change. People who are casually racist, they genuinely believe that people of color should not have equal rights to white people. That's a genuine belief that exists. And we have to tackle that in every single form that it takes if we're going to actually reach racial equality in a country like Australia. So I think it's about having many conversations all the time and in all different ways, but also using our voices to stand up for the people who are the most discriminated against, the people who suffered the most oppression. And I definitely think that right now it's incredibly important that we band together to support Indigenous Australians.
चलिए, काफी गंभीर विषयों पर बात हो रही है, फिर माहौल को थोड़ा सा हल्का पुल्का करते हैं और जोया की पसंद का एक और गीत सुनते हैं और फिर वापस आकर अपनी बातचीत जारी रखते हैं।
किरण, I love you. I love you, किरण।
वाह, क्या तेवर है सुनील के आने का।
जादू तेरी नजर, खुशबू तेरा बदन, जादू तेरी नजर, खुशबू तेरा बदन, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू है मेरी किरण, तू है मेरी किरण। फासले और कम हो रहे हैं, दूर से पास हम हो रहे हैं, फासले और कम हो रहे हैं, दूर से पास हम हो रहे हैं, मांग लूंगा तुझे आसमां से, छीन लूंगा तुझे इस जहां से, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू है मेरी किरण, तू है मेरी किरण, जादू तेरी नजर, खुशबू तेरा बदन, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू है मेरी किरण, 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 तू है मेरी किरण।
जी हाँ, आप सुन रहे हैं रेडियो मनपसंद FM 91.1 पर और हम बातचीत कर रहे हैं जोया पटेल के साथ, जो कि मशहूर राइटर और एडिटर हैं। उनके पसंद के गीत सुने और लगता है इनके पसंद के गीत शाहरुख खान के गीत अधिक हैं और इसी पर हम आगे ये बातचीत जारी कर रखते हैं। तन्वी और हम बातचीत कर रहे हैं जोया पटेल के साथ।
हम बातचीत कर रहे हैं जोया पटेल से। जोया, जैसा कि आपको बताया कि वो एक राइटर और एडिटर हैं और जिन विषयों पर हम बात कर रहे हैं काफी गंभीर विषयों पर बात कर रहे हैं, रेसिज्म और आइडेंटिटी क्राइसिस। यहाँ पर जो यंग माइग्रेंट्स क्या सभी माइग्रेंट्स को फेस करनी पड़ती हैं ये समस्याएं। जो आपने गीत सुना वो भी जोया की पसंद का था। Zoya, I think you are an admirer of Shah Rukh Khan, reading your book. It was a long time ago, maybe. And I think that you also related. How does it, like, when you were with your white friends, they could not see anything good in Shah Rukh Khan, while with your brown friends, you could relate to that,
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, it's funny. I grew up, watching Bollywood movies. That's what we did when we were all together as a family. That's what we would be watching. And I had a really big thing for both Salman Khan and Shah Rukh Khan growing up. And the story that I tell in the book is about, we're all teenage girls and we're all saying what celebrities we think are really cute. And, everyone's saying Orlando Bloom or like some other guy. And I said, I think Shah Rukh Khan is really cute. And I even I don't know where I got this picture because that was before we had smartphones. So I probably printed one off and took it with me to be like, look, isn't he? And my friend was like, oh no. It was like, God, why would you be interested in that? And I remember thinking to myself at the time, I felt so upset by that. And I felt at the time, it's because he's Indian. How silly of me to think that an Indian man could be attractive, because obviously I should just like Orlando Bloom like everyone else. And when my book came out, that friend who I'm still very close with read it and she said, I never thought about how that would have made you feel, but it had never been part of the cultural conversation to find anyone other than a Hollywood actor, cute in the cultural zeitgeist. It wasn't cool to like anyone other than a Hollywood actor. And to me, that's actually part of kind of casual racism, because that says that what we're told growing up is that, these things are good and these things are why would you be interested in that? And now I'm really fascinated by how, if I look back on my youth and in the things that I like to think about it critically and say, well, do I actually like that thing, or was I just always told that I couldn't like these other things? And so I learnt, to stop watching Bollywood movies, and I learnt to stop listening to Bollywood music, because if I wanted to be cool and to have any kind of, cultural relevance at school, I had to like the things that everyone else liked. And these days, it's quite funny, because then, of course, everyone went through this period where they really loved Bollywood. And when I was at the Australian National University, they used to do a ball called the Ekta Ball, which was, I think it's South Asian, basically, communities. And a whole bunch of my white friends would go to this ball and they'd all dress up in saris and dance to Bollywood music. And I was furious. I was like, I'm sorry. When we were growing up and I was dressing up in my sari and wearing that to the year 10 formal, everyone thought that was really uncool. And now you guys are putting on saris and dancing. Honestly, how unfair is that? I thought it was quite ironic, right? Once, and this is cultural appropriation. This is when white communities decide that something is cool and they take it and they make it theirs. But if I take it and make it mine as someone who's actually Indian, it can't be cool because I don't have any cultural capital. And that was something that I think really impacted me. I think there was a distinct point when I was a teenager when I tried really hard to downplay how Indian I was. And I got rid of my Indian clothes and I dressed differently and I straightened my hair so that it wouldn't be curly. And, I tried really hard to just fit in and be more white. And I feel really sad when I think about that now, because now I'm trying to reconnect with some of those things, and I feel as if I missed out on, all of these opportunities to enjoy the things that I enjoyed because I was trying so hard to just fit in.
Yeah, this point about the cultural appropriation is quite interesting. Today is the International Yoga Day. Yoga is a gift of India to the Western world. And I was reading an interesting article. This Indian lady was saying that she stopped yoga because she found that all the yoga instructors are white.
Yeah.
And the word yoga also has been appropriated because the actually pronunciation is yog, but they can't say yoga. And I think you have a chapter on that also. How do they mispronounce our words and they take those words?
Yeah.
And I think you make a reference that how these Hollywood actresses wear bindis without understanding any significance of that. So that cultural appropriation, you find it frustrating.
I do, and I think it's particularly important when we talk about cultural appropriation to realize that, people will often use this argument where they say, well, I'm sorry, Indians wanted yoga to become popular. There was actually this whole, if you look at it in the 60s, the Indian government tried really hard to export yoga because it was an economic decision. But the point about cultural appropriation isn't that people in India are upset about it. It's that people like us who are migrants living in these countries are upset about it. And the reason for that is we're the ones who face the discrimination in our communities and are told that that's because we're Indian, right? So the Indian things about us are used to ridicule us and to denigrate us. I remember being told that my food was smelly when I went to school because I had curry. But if a white person wants to go to an Indian restaurant and they decide that that's cool, that's totally fine. They can eat the smelly food, but I'm not allowed to. And, you know, if I wore a salwar kameez or a ghagra choli and wore that to a school mufti day or whatever, people thought that that was uncool, and why wasn't I just wearing jeans and a t-shirt? But when my white friends wear a sari, it's a completely different thing. And so the thing about cultural appropriation is that it impacts our communities, as in migrant communities. It doesn't impact people in India in the same way because they don't face the continuous discrimination from white cultures on a day-by-day basis. So it's actually not a relevant argument to say, well, Indians in India are fine with it, because it's not about Indians in India. It's about people like you and I who have to live here and deal with the fact that, you know, whenever I go to a yoga class, I have to hear white instructors mispronounce the names of poses or use namaste incorrectly at the end of every yoga class. You know, it's incredibly frustrating. So I actually don't go to yoga classes anymore. I use an app at home. It's a lot easier.
I understand that. Now, as a young teenager, you went on this tour of Harmony, and this was supposed to increase the awareness of multicultural society. And you found that whole experience very strange, as it was planned by, you know, white bureaucrats sitting in Canberra, and the audience was also not engaged. Now, this tokenism, I mean, you find that this is just a tokenism, but isn't that tokenism is also important in the sense that that's somewhere you have to make that beginning to make these changes?
I do agree that you have to kind of start somewhere. But the thing that I write about with that particular tour is the whole approach came from this like weird assumption that the reason why communities are racist is because they just haven't been exposed to enough, you know, brown people. And if we just, the whole idea was, oh, we'll just take this busload of brown people into these little communities on the coast and we'll say, look, they're really nice. They dance on stage. They perform for you. Can't we all just get along? And as I write in the book, the problem with that is that people aren't racist because let's put it this way. People aren't only racist because they're ignorant. Often, especially when we're talking about how much racism is heightened in small communities and in the countryside, the reason for that is because country towns typically have really scarce resources. There aren't a lot of jobs. There aren't a lot of things that people can do. And when you bring new people into communities like that, the first attitude that people have is one where they kind of close down to strangers. You know, it becomes us and them really quickly. And the way to address that isn't just by saying, you know, I brought, you know, 3 Indians and a couple of Pacific Islanders and they did an assembly show. The way to address that is to actually talk about difference and equality and address some of the reasons why that kind of scarcity exists. So people need more jobs. We need to have better education across Australia. These are all issues that are actually about equality for everyone. And when we treat issues like that, instead of allowing people to blame ethnic minorities or blame, you know, new people who are coming into their communities, you can actually create better change. I do think that like some level of tokenism is inevitable when we talk about ending racism. And I do think that, you know, like multicultural festivals and things like that are actually really important. But the difference is that when we have the Canberra Multicultural Festival and we have stages all around Civic and people are performing dances from their cultures, that's being led by communities for their communities. And they're actually doing that because they want to showcase their culture. And it's a great way for people to learn about different things. The difference here was that it was a bunch of, you know, white bureaucrats who thought, well, maybe like, you know, you're from Ghana, so you can do like a hip hop dance and like you can wear a sari and maybe, you know, it was completely contrived and not authentic. And I think that's the key thing. It still has to be authentic for it to be respectful to our cultures and to be led by us instead of being kind of imposed on us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get what you mean. It can feel also, especially like diminishing, feeling like that the only purpose you're there is because of what you can contribute to, say a white bureaucrat's interpretation of diversity. It's like, I'm not just that, I'm multifaceted. And you also talk about feminism in your book. So feminism for a time had only really accommodated for the experiences of white women.
Yeah.
But now in the recent decades, it's somewhat expanded to make sure that women of color, women of different sexualities and identifications are included. But this representation can still feel somewhat tokenistic. So do you think that feminism has really accounted for beyond the Western view of gender roles and has come up with ways to combat sexism that is sensitive to the cultural nuances? For example, the way that women are viewed in India, like those are gender roles that people carry when they come to Australia. Like people growing up are not only trying to manage the gender roles that the Western view projects onto them, but I guess what their family does as well. So do you think feminism is really accounting for that? And if not, how could it improve?
I think the biggest problem with feminism as a concept is that people see it as one movement and it isn't. It's always been a really fragmented movement with different groups pushing for different things at different times. And unfortunately, when feminism gained kind of a second wave of mainstream popularity in our lifetime, so I'm thinking about like the early 2000s onwards, it was packaged up in this way that was really white and kind of promoted in a way that was, I always felt, a little bit more about kind of making money and selling things than about actually creating change. And I agree that it was a kind of tokenistic attempt to have some diversity. And I'm thinking like a classic example would be something like the Spice Girls, where you have 4 women and they just threw a black woman in there too, and then she had to be Crazy Spice or whatever because, you know, black women are crazy. Like there was no attempt to actually have a genuine representation of diversity. And that has been the case by and large. And I think things are changing, but mostly because people are starting to actually promote diverse voices in that conversation instead of hoping that white women will represent the needs and the experiences and the views of women of color. And I think the best way to kind of take that forward is to really self-select to listen to diverse voices. You know, I make a point of really like following lots of Indigenous women activists and like trans women and women with different experiences from me so that I can understand their viewpoints more and to be a good ally instead of speaking for them. One of the things that I think is interesting about what you just raised there, Tanvi, about, you know, the gender roles that are different in different cultures is I really noticed when we started talking in the kind of mainstream about Muslim women that the way in which white feminism tried to define Muslim women was really offensive to me. So, you know, my mum wears a hijab and a lot of the language was like, oh, well, the hijab can only be oppressive and how sad that her husband makes her wear that hijab. And I remember thinking, you know, my mum started wearing the hijab when she turned 40 and I'm pretty sure it's because, you know, a combination of wanting to be closer to her faith and, you know, her hair started going grey. It was probably like a nice way to deal with that, you know, and it was a decision that she made and my father had no say in it whatsoever. And anyone who actually is interested could find out pretty quickly that the Quran does not say that you have to wear a hijab. It says that you have to, if you make that decision, you have to make it with a lot of thought and a lot of commitment. And that was a point at which, you know, I'm not a practicing Muslim. I don't identify as a Muslim at all. And I would never wear the hijab because I don't want to. But that's a choice that I can make. And taking that choice away from migrant women by saying, no, you're oppressed. You know, we've decided that you're oppressed. So you should be different and your culture should be different because why wouldn't you want to be like us? That's another form of racism. And the only way that you can really stand by the experiences of women of color and actually support them when they do want change is to let them lead that conversation. So, I mean, what I'd like to see for feminism is more listening on every side, and a better attempt to actually let people speak for themselves.
Finally, I think you talked about feminism, and when we talk about feminism, I'm not sure whether it is focused on the serious issues which in Australia, Indian women face. You know, we have this dowry demands and domestic violence, and I think, as you have said in your book also, in our community, we do not talk about these things openly. How do we change this situation?
Yeah, I think part of the reason why we don't talk about these things properly is because, especially in the Western media, there's a tendency to kind of choose a handful of people from every community who are allowed to talk about things, and they're the community leaders. And there's not really an attempt to go beyond that. And I mean, I notice this myself because I often get asked to speak to the media, and there are many times that I say, well, I'm not really the person to speak on that issue, or, you know, I shouldn't have to speak on all the issues. Maybe you could try some of these people. There's a laziness, I think, that comes in when it comes to these really complicated issues where people don't want to understand them properly, or, you know, have to learn the complexity to actually then be able to talk about them. So I think part of the issue is actually creating avenues for understanding. And I think part of the issue is also just giving more opportunity for migrant women, especially recent migrants, because it's especially hard if you have any kind of language barrier to actually get support. But I think it's about providing avenues for them to engage more with society about these issues. So when I say that, I mean things like radio programs like your own, and I also mean things like community programs that actually try and connect people more rather than kind of coming in, solving a problem and leaving, which is often what happens. And I also think that there's some good work happening in this space. There are some pretty amazing Australian Indian women who are working really hard on the dowry issue, for example, like Dr. Manjula O'Connor, who I mentioned in the book, who's in Victoria. And there's some really incredible programs that are coming together to address some of these things. But the problem is that they can only work insofar as they're funded. So I think what I want to see is, you know, more political leadership on these issues, and more of an attempt to empower communities to actually speak for themselves and to raise the issues, but also come up with the solutions in a way that's, you know, driven by the community and that's still inclusive of our kind of cultural needs as well. It's very complex, but I do think that things will get better.
Yeah. This has been a very interesting discussion. I think we can keep talking about hours, but then we don't have enough time. I would like to thank you. I think these are like, you know, we hope with these discussions, at least we can raise awareness and hopefully change the attitude over the time. It takes time, change, but we need to talk about that. And in that regard, I think I admire your effort in writing the book, the No Country Woman, and then other articles and the other efforts you are doing in this direction. Thank you very much, Joya, for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really insightful, and I really appreciate everything you had to say.
Thank you guys so much. This is a great conversation. I really enjoyed myself.
Thank you.
दोस्तों, आप सुन रहे थे जोया पटेल के साथ बातचीत। आशा है आपको ये बातचीत पसंद आई होगी। लगता है कि बातचीत स्ट्रीम नहीं हो पाई 12 बजे के बाद वेबसाइट पर और ऐप पर, लेकिन अगर आप ये प्रोग्राम फिर सुनना चाहते हैं तो शाम को फिर 3 से 5 के बीच में प्रसारित किया जाएगा और इसकी एक रिकॉर्डिंग भी रखी जाएगी। आशा है कि आपको आज का कार्यक्रम पसंद आया होगा और ये बातचीत भी पसंद आई होगी। अगर आपका कोई इस बारे में विचार है तो आप ज़रूर हमें बता सकते हैं रेडियो मनपसंद की ईमेल पर और ऐप के द्वारा। आइए कार्यक्रम के अंत करते हैं इस गीत के साथ। ये भी जोया की पसंद का जो है गीत है, मेहंदी लगा के रखना।
ये कुड़ियां नशे दिया कुड़ियां,
ये मुंडे गली दे गुंडे,
ये कुड़ियां नशे दिया कुड़ियां,
ये मुंडे गली दे गुंडे,
नशे दिया कुड़ियां,
गली दे गुंडे।
मेहंदी लगा के रखना, डोली सजा के रखना, मेहंदी लगा के रखना, डोली सजा के रखना, लेने तुझे ओ गोरी आएंगे तेरे सजना।
मेहंदी लगा के रखना, डोली सजा के रखना, ओहो ओहो।
सेहरा सजा के रखना, चेहरा छुपा के रखना, सेहरा सजा के रखना, चेहरा छुपा के रखना, ये दिल की बात अपने दिल में दबा के रखना। सेहरा सजा
इशारे, दिल थाम के खड़े हैं आशिक सभी गवारे।
छुप जाए सारी कुड़ियाँ घर में शर्म के मारे, गाँव में आ गए हैं पागल शहर के सारे।
नजरें झुका के रखना, दामन बचा के रखना, नजरें झुका के रखना, दामन बचा के रखना। लेने तुझे ओ गोरी आएंगे तेरे सजना।
मेहंदी लगा के रखना, डोली सजा के रखना,
सेहरा सजा के रखना, चेहरा छुपा के रखना।
मैं आपसे अब विदा लेना चाहूँगा, और जैसा कि कहा, अगर कार्यक्रम के बारे में कोई विचार हो तो ज़रूर आप बताइए। और ये कार्यक्रम आप सुनना मत भूलिए, हर रविवार को 10 से 12 के बीच में, और मंगलवार को शाम को 7 से 8 के बीच में होता है FM 91.1 पर, लेकिन 24 घंटे 7 दिन रेडियो मनपसंद ऐप पर। नमस्कार।
तकना, दरवाजा खुला रखना, लेने तुझे ओ गोरी आएंगे तेरे सजना।
कुछ और अब न कहना, कुछ और अब न करना, कुछ और